Welcome to 132 Problems Revisiting Mormon Polygamy. I hope that everybody has already seen the announcement that I released on Friday morning. Cheryl, Bruno, and I are both so excited about this new adventure, the Academic Journal of Mormon Polygamy, which we are both working like crazy to launch, and which is going to be an incredible tool and vehicle to elevate these conversations and keep this topic going and bring more and more attention to it. I hope that you are all anticipating that and as excited about it as we are. And in keeping with that, Cheryl and I, since we just spent the weekend together at JWHA, discussing the Whitney Documents, the episodes that I have recently done. Part 1, I think, is episode 129. And then the last 2 weeks were parts 2 and part 3. And we had a lot of conversations at JWHA with several other historians discussing the Whitney Documents. So Cheryl agreed to come on and just kind of bat these ideas back and forth and share some preliminary ideas about them. Please don't look at this in any way as a debate or as trying to best one another. In fact, I really appreciate how supportive Cheryl has been when she thinks I'm making good arguments. She also for sure lets me know when she thinks I'm not making good arguments, and I appreciate it so much. It's sometimes tough, but this is exactly what we need for all of us to get sharpened and to be able to do better and better as we engage in the discourse on these topics. So a huge thank you to Cheryl for coming on and discussing the Whitney Documents. Cheryl and I just barely recorded our announcement about the Journal of Mormon Polygamy. So please look for that announcement because we are terribly excited about it. And it's really going to be the cutting edge, the receptacle of the best research and scholarship that is being done on polygamy at this time. So look out for that. But also, Cheryl and I have been having so many conversations. We're on the phone quite a bit, sometimes intense conversations. I know that both of us can get triggered by things that the other one has said, but what I think is so valuable is that both Cheryl and I have stuck with it. We've stuck in there through the difficult conversations, through the difficult misunderstandings or differences in perspective. And as a result, we've really gained tremendous respect for one another. And I would say we've become really, really good friends. I genuinely love Cheryl. And so as I was doing, thank you. But genuinely, I just adore Cheryl. I'm so glad that she is willing to engage in this way and that she's in my life. It's wonderful. And as we have been doing this work, we thought it would be useful to kind of let you see some of our engagement. And so since I have recently done this work on the Whitney Documents, Cheryl has been willing to engage with them. And she said, well, let's just come and talk about them. So did I introduce that all right, Cheryl?
Yes, absolutely. I am so excited about Michelle's last 3 podcasts where she has talked about or given 1, 2, and 3 of the Whitney Documents. And I kind of want to come on here and push back maybe a little bit and just tell why I think this is such an important work. I have said many times that as a historian, it's hard for me to come on a podcast and just talk about a document without researching it for many, many weeks and making sure I know exactly what, and I've done all my background research. And I really admire Michelle for making us part of her investigations. She's willing to put up her thoughts about each document, each thing as they come to her, and let us kind of see the process, which is really valuable. And so with the Whitney Documents, I think she's still kind of in the middle of her investigation, but still letting us be a part of how that is going. And I love that. It's been so much fun. It's very difficult for me, but I'm enjoying our conversations. So hopefully we can provide you a little peek behind the scenes of the kinds of things that we do when we talk together on the phone. And I wanted to start. Okay.
So,
I
what
wanted to
Cheryl is saying in part is that she's really putting herself on the line right now in a way that is not as comfortable for her, because historians generally do all their research, write up a paper, have plenty of time to think about it, nail it down, and to kind of join in the ongoing conversation. Like I always say, tell me if I'm missing something, tell me if I'm wrong, right? So I really appreciate Cheryl's willingness to step into this other space of discussing things that we are currently exploring and investigating.
Right. And right now, I'll have to tell you, I don't know what to think about the Whitney documents, because Michelle has brought up many things that we have not discussed as historians. We tend to think the Whitney documents are a very solid case for Joseph Smith's polygamy, and we don't realize that some of the documents haven't been investigated very, very closely. And that is what Michelle has done in her past 3 episodes. So I would hope that some of the historians would go on, and if they, or everybody who hasn't seen them, why don't you, if this podcast interests you, go on those previous 3 and she'll delve deeper into the documents. But this one is just going to go over the 3 main documents and then maybe just a little bit more information that wasn't brought out in the first 3. So,
perfect. So this is generally an overview of the 3 main Whitney documents that I covered: the Revelation, the letter, and the blessing. That's parts 1, 2, and 3 of the Whitney documents. I'll link them in the description below. So go ahead and start with this one. And if you're interested in the Whitney documents, dive in a little more and let's have this. This is exactly the conversations that we're wanting to start, because I'm not claiming to have all truth, but I'm thrilled that people can recognize there are questions we haven't answered. So also, thank you, Cheryl, again.
Michelle and I have this conversational style where we just interrupt each other all the time. So you might have to get used to that, where we kind of jump in whenever we want. But one of the things that I have to give a little caveat before you listen to do they call them volumes 1 and 2?
I just say part 1, part 2, and part 3.
Part 1 and part 2, because Michelle started out part 1 and part 2 by presenting the 2 different narratives. And I was very triggered by that, because I didn't feel that she had represented my narrative very well. But the interesting thing I found from that was that really the Mormon historians and church writers and who else? People,
the ex-Mormons. The ex-Mormons and the
too.
anti-Mormons.
We all have sort of a different narrative. None of us have the same narrative. As I pushed on some people, I asked them, well, what if you could talk about Joseph Smith's polygamy in just like a paragraph, what would you say? And some of them said, well, we feel that it was something that God commanded him to live, but that he did it sort of poorly. And others said other things. And I believe myself that Joseph Smith was commanded by God, but he felt very strongly that he was commanded by God, but also wanted to knock down social conventions, which was happening in the time. And so I have sort of a little bit different narrative. And so I don't think you'll notice in her 3rd, she didn't try to represent our narrative, because we all have a different way of looking at Joseph Smith's polygamy, which is fascinating. But so I think that narrowing down on what a document looks like and what it tells us might be a little bit more productive than to try to fit these things into a narrative. Many times they don't fit into any specific polygamy narrative.
That was actually also a valuable experience for me, although very painful, because in these episodes, I did try, like I was thinking, okay, I want to make these so historians can engage with them without having, massive problems. And right from the beginning of both of them, I totally stepped in it unintentionally. So it was good to recognize, like Cheryl was actually quite upset with both of them. And it was good for me, both of us, I think it helped us both recognize, these can't be quantified into 2 sides. There are, like you were saying, there are so many different narratives. So that's a valuable thing right there to understand. There aren't 2 sides that we are arguing. And I hadn't fully recognized that, right? And then so I think a lot of us, anyway, that's why this engagement is so necessary, because we keep opening up greater understanding for both of us on both sides.
Yeah, because I hadn't realized it either. I thought like everybody on my side thinks exactly the way I do. And come to find out, no, they really don't. So, but let's look at the first document, which you covered, and that was a Whitney revelation, a revelation given to Noel K. Whitney, giving him the wording to perform the marriage ceremony between his daughter and Joseph Smith. So this is the document that we have. And this was, the date on this is 27th of July, 1842. And what I didn't realize about this one that Michelle brought out was that we do not have a contemporary copy of this revelation. As you notice right here, it's a typescript. And this typescript was given to Joseph F. Smith in 1912. By a descendant. And so
Orson Whitney.
Orson Whitney gave this to Joseph F. Smith in 1912. And we do have two handwritten copies of this revelation. And these copies are 19th century documents, but we're not sure who wrote them. And we're not sure what the dating is on these. And they are unidentified, so we don't know what the provenance of these documents is either. So Michelle brought out that this is an important thing to know when you are relying on this for your argument that Joseph Smith gave the wording of the revelation to Newell, because the document just isn't real solid. So I don't question the document very much, though. I feel that it was something that Joseph Smith gave to Noel K. Whitney, and I'm going to let Michelle talk a little bit about, just real quickly, why she doesn't feel the revelation is
necessarily a valid revelation. Has a different explanation. So it's been interesting going back and forth on this. And again, I would recommend watching the episode because I go into it more fully. But it was a fun investigation to see the I guess the main thing that I was trying to bring out that I appreciate Cheryl for picking up on and recognizing is that this is not solid enough to be relied on as it is, as a certain document. There are questions about it. Some of the things that I saw as questionable, in addition to the provenance, are some of the wordings. I'm trying to go off the top of my head of what I talked about, but it's very interesting that it says S.A. Whitney in some key points. Every time it doesn't talk about Sarah or Sarah Ann, it has Newell pronounce on his daughter it has Newell call his daughter S.A. Whitney, which is very strange. Also, the timing of it is really difficult, especially in comparison to Elizabeth Ann Whitney's autobiography, where she tells us the sequence of events, and this just doesn't fit in. It takes Orson Whitney decades later changing his grandmother's autobiography and sort of reforming it without, he wasn't born. I think he was born in 1855, if I recall. So he's trying to make it make sense in light of this later document that he seems to have found the handwritten copies of. So there are many
Let
things.
me jump in right here
Yep.
quick, because I feel with my conversations with Don Bradley on many subjects, he always tries to nail down the timeline of things. And I think this is really valuable. And Michelle has brought up many instances where the timeline is not working out with these Whitney documents. And again, if you go back to her podcast, you'll see some of these things that she's brought up. But I also went ahead and did my own timeline of each document, put them in time. And I didn't put in, like this one, tell me the date again of this one.
Let's see, it's right there. July 27th, 1842, which is
right.
The date ascribed to the wedding as well.
So quite early, but I couldn't put it in my timeline in 1842. I had to put it much later. I could have put it probably somewhere in the 19th century because of those two handwritten documents. But since they aren't dated, I had to actually put this revelation in 1912, if I'm going to be honest about it. So I had to put that revelation all the way down in 1912 because that's the earliest that we know it came to pass. So some of these, and also some of the internal datings of these revelations do not fit with other affidavits and other stories that were told about the Sarah Ann Whitney marriage. So this is very important, this timing, and you'll see this as we go on.
Right.
Also, Michelle just made a great point also that Sarah Ann was not referred to, well, Joseph Smith did not refer to people by their initials. Generally, he would call them, by
name.
Right. My daughter
Their
Emma,
first name.
or my servant Newell, or something like that. And so for him to use S.A. Whitney, N.K. Whitney, that kind of thing, just is a bit different than what we're used to seeing in the other documents.
There are also some idiosyncratic spellings that show up in other people's work more than in Joseph Smith's. For example, priesthood in this is spelled capital P-R-E-A-S-T space H-O-O-D, so priesthood with priest with that spelling. And that shows
one of the 19th century documents has that spelling.
And that shows up from Heber C. Kimball, who interestingly became Sarah Ann Whitney's husband. Right. And so we have a lot of questions about this that give us some pause, as well as, I think, Cheryl, we've also discussed quite a bit the affidavits, the 1869 affidavits, because that's what backs up this document. But again, those are also really problematic. So it's kind of this circular, you rely on one to validate the other, but neither of them is anchored in a way that makes them solid enough to support the narrative, in my opinion. We have more questions to ask.
So let's just jump real quick, because we don't want this to be like a 3-hour podcast. But,
okay. I did want to mention one other thing that we've been talking about, because we also have looked at how other scholars have talked about this. For example, how Todd Compton presents it, how Brian Hales presents it, how others, and they really do just kind of ignore these problems, kind of use ellipses or fudge them out. And we spoke about how they have worked to create a seamless narrative based on the documents, but the problem is you can't do that. You can't create a seamless narrative with these documents because they don't support a seamless narrative. So things have been presented in a way that really minimizes and hides the problems.
And this isn't probably as disturbing to me as it is to Michelle, because as historians, we see this all the time. In our documents, we see many different, somebody gets a date wrong, or, something doesn't line up quite right. And usually it's more suspicious if everything is just perfect,
Okay.
That's a little bit more suspicious. But when we have documents coming later, especially later in time, and they're not, even when they are contemporary, we often see this, problems and differences. So that doesn't.
And I push back on that a little bit in this case, because as I said to Cheryl before, we can see the sausage being made. We can see what document they're relying on to create a new narrative, and how it's being, like how Orson F. Whitney is trying to make these all work in. And which is why I argue, and I think Cheryl agrees, that we should prioritize the contemporary sources, which in this case, interestingly enough, would be the 1842 affidavit, where in the Times and Seasons, they reprinted the statement on marriage, and both Newell and Elizabeth Whitney signed affidavits saying that was the only law of marriage that they knew of at all in the church. That would have happened just a few months after Sarah Ann's supposed marriage, and before 132 was transcribed, was written down by William Clayton. So it really is endlessly fascinating. There's a lot to discuss.
I must say it takes me aback a little bit, because I am counting on this document, this as being a contemporary document, and then to come to find out we don't have the contemporary document for this. We do not. We have these two other copies that have been written later. And so as much as we say this is in 1842, we cannot date this to 1842. Sorry.
Excellent. Thank you. And just really quickly, I know we're moving on, but also that last paragraph that's added on seamlessly, Orson F. Whitney just stops the revelation for his typescript, but there's a last paragraph that seems to be a journal entry. So it's very clearly been cobbled somehow, this isn't an original revelation written. So anyway, so there are lots of problems.
Stopping yourself and not saying fudged.
Oh.
I tell Michelle she can't use the word lie or fudge or anything like that.
There seem to be some some irregularities with how this was transcribed by whoever did it. She's training me. I'm learning. I'm very willing to learn. Okay.
Yes, because we really don't know. We don't know that someone's lying, or we don't know that someone's fudging, but we do know that there are some irregularities.
Excellent. Okay. They could have been created a different way than being fudged. Okay. Do you want to go on to the next document?
Yes, please. Let's go on to the second document. And this is a letter written by Joseph Smith. And this one, everyone loves this one because it's one of the few documents that is written in Joseph Smith's handwriting. And it's so lovely to see his actual words written in this document. And I think the handwriting has been verified in this. And so I don't think that anyone disagrees that this is Joseph Smith's letter to Noel K. Whitney and his wife Elizabeth. The problem comes in, it says to...
I'll put this up instead and see if that makes it a little bit easier. Dear
Yes.
and beloved brother and sister Whitney and so-and-so, and et cetera.
Right. So now this is written also in August of 1842, but it wasn't until the affidavits, the polygamy affidavits were written in 1869 that we find out that the et cetera is their daughter, Sarah Ann. Many people have just assumed that this is Sarah Ann, the et cetera is Sarah Ann, but we find out in 1869 when Sister Whitney and her daughter go to Joseph F. Smith and swear out an affidavit that this letter is their daughter,
Right.
addressed to their daughter. So there are some possibilities that this could have been.
Can I very quickly share this? Because this, I point out in that affidavit, Sarah Ann and Elizabeth supposedly swear out an affidavit that the third party was Sarah. But again, the problem with that affidavit is, brings up some questions. I know Cheryl and I see this differently. I just wanted to point that out.
Okay, so to keep this up for just a second, because we have gone back and forth on the affidavits, and we would like to learn a little bit more about the affidavits. I feel that that's pretty obvious to me, but not to Michelle, that this is a copy of a document because it is written in Joseph F. Smith's handwriting, and the signatures are done by Joseph F. Smith. He doesn't, in most cases, he doesn't even try to disguise, the signature, that he is just copying it. Also,
in some cases. In some cases. Okay.
The notary is in the same handwriting as the signatures, etc. So anyway, I have not studied the affidavits. I would like to study the affidavits more, and I would like to have more information on them, and hopefully more information is forthcoming on these documents. But if you'd like to do a great project, analyze these documents because they're very interesting.
And submit your paper to the Journal of Mormon Polygamy, because that's exactly what the goal is here. I will say to Cheryl that my sense is that when these were discovered, and I couldn't remember who it was that was working on his master's thesis and was able to gain access to these in the church history library, I was just amazed that he was getting to look at them. And so my feeling has been they were so excited to find them that they just accepted them uncritically and thought, we now know all of these, we now have all of these answers. And I don't think that even from that, anytime since that point, they have been looked at critically enough. And I think that they need to be. So that's why this is such an important project.
Yeah, I would definitely agree that these affidavits need to be looked at, and that they are later and they were created for a different purpose. So let's go back to that letter. And I think that Michelle makes very interesting case for it not to be talking about polygamy. I have always read it with polygamy in mind and thinking that it fits well with the narrative of Joseph Smith wanting to meet with Sarah Ann, his new wife, and have Newell and Elizabeth bring her to his hiding place. However, Michelle has a little bit different take on it, and I thought it was very well thought out, and it was point well taken, well made, that I had to think about as I listened to her podcast on it.
So that's excellent. So again, I don't claim to know for sure, but I so appreciate that what we're saying is more work needs to be done on this.
Right.
Right. That's
one more point too is if you look up at the top and look at the date there, which is August 18th, is that 1842?
Yeah.
I can't really see it, but that is written in different handwriting. The Joseph Smith papers say that this is William Clayton's handwriting.
Let me see if I can get to that close up. It's dated by William Clayton, and it's written Nauvoo and the date. Yep.
Right. So we have Nauvoo, August 18th, 1842, and Joseph Smith paper says that this is written in William Clayton's handwriting, and then the rest of the letter is Joseph Smith's handwriting and his signature. So that presents a question. When did William Clayton get a hold of this letter? When did he ever have the letter? Was it delivered directly to Noel K. Whitney, and then later on Clayton had the letter in his possession? Or was the letter delivered to them by William Clayton? This is very interesting, and I don't think that people have really looked at that closely and tried to discover what the meaning of that might be, how William Clayton was involved in this.
And I will say we had a fun, like late night, almost all-nighter session discussing this at JWHA with several other historians, just discussing like my new hypothesis. I don't want to overstate it, but my wondering about whether this letter was ever even delivered because of all of the questions about why wasn't it destroyed? Why was it dated and a location put? Why would that be necessary unless it was for filing purposes? How did it come across the plane? Several other questions that seem to be better answered by the case that William Clayton saw this as useful rather than that he delivered it. Also, according to the Joseph Smith papers, William Clayton gives us different stories, but in his own story, he was not yet what Brian Hales likes to call a polygamy insider. He didn't yet know about Joseph Smith's polygamy. So he saw this letter and wouldn't have like Joseph let him read it without being worried about it revealing polygamy. Apparently, there are a lot of interesting.
Yeah, we don't know that. We don't know that he saw that before he was an insider. We do not know this. We do not know when this date was added.
Right. The Joseph Smith papers do say in their historical introduction that the date was added before the letter was delivered, but they don't support that. I don't know how they know that. Maybe it's just trying to reason it through.
Yeah, I don't see how it would have been added before the letter was delivered if the letter is indeed talking about polygamy, because as you said, William Clayton was not a polygamy insider, and Joseph Smith would not have wanted to reveal that to him, at the time. Point. So,
right. So again, endless, fascinating, a lot more thought can be done on this that someone can write up in a journal article that we can engage with. And I think that's valuable.
Yes, push back on it. Mm-hmm. Also, one other thing about this letter is Michelle has brought up whether or not Noel K. Whitney and Elizabeth ever received the letter. Perhaps they never received the letter. We don't have any indication that they did visit Joseph Smith at Carlos Goves. Is that where he was?
Carlos Granger's.
Granger. Okay, so we do have, I think William Clayton took meticulous notes of who was visiting, but he does not include them. So we do not know that they visited him or their daughters. Right. So maybe they didn't ever receive the letter. We don't know.
Right. Thank you. So, okay, this is really validating to hear you engaging with this and seeing, and of course, what I love about Cheryl is that she will, I feel like Cheryl has just so much integrity and scholastic integrity, and in every way where she's not defending a narrative, she's just looking at the sources and what they say. So she both will acknowledge when a good point is made and push back when she thinks something is weak. And that's an example that I want all of us to follow, everybody on the academic side and in the skeptic movement, because we all need to be able to do that. We should all want the truth, not just our bias, to win out.
Yeah, and let me just reiterate for those of you who don't know, perhaps you haven't heard me talk about this before, but I am of the opinion that Joseph Smith originated polygamy and practiced it as well. And I feel that these things can be explained, perhaps such as the Whitney documents, we just haven't looked at them real closely in the past. And I know I haven't. I've just accepted that they are contemporary documents and that they refer to polygamy. So I think that I need to look at them a little closer and kind of figure out how some of these things can be explained and understood.
Excellent.
So,
And can I tell them the topic that you're working on for your journal article?
yes.
Is that so?
Yeah.
Cheryl is working in depth right now on the High Council meeting that I want to say August 12th, 1843 High Council meeting, where supposedly Hiram read what we now have as 132 according to the affidavits. And so that for Cheryl is very strong evidence. And I would agree that is an important topic for us to get to. Cheryl and I have a few back and forths because she doesn't want me to do my episode on it until she's written her article. But I feel like I need to do my episode.
Sure you will.
We'll see what happens. But anyway, I just wanted to say there are other reasons. Like Cheryl is willing to look at these Whitney documents honestly, because she's not motivated to say they have to prove this. And she has other reasons to have the conclusions that she has at this time.
Yeah, and I mean, I ask the same thing of everyone when I present my findings on the High Council. I'd like for people to take that seriously and not just say, "Oh, well, we can't ever trust the expositor. We can't trust this or we can't trust that." And yes, it's true that some things might have discrepancies, but don't just throw everything out without looking at it closely like we're doing tonight.
Right. And I do have my information for that and my way of looking at it. But it's really important to, I guess, this is the goal. This has been my goal. It's not necessarily to prove to everyone that my conclusion is correct. It's just to say we need to have conversations. And if we can move the dial enough that people on both sides of the argument can agree that intelligent, informed, well-meaning, honest people can come to a different conclusion than they can, then we've made progress, right? Because right now I feel like there's a lot of bias against anyone that's a polygamy denier, that they're just, like there's no openness to believing that someone can see these documents and come to a different conclusion on that side. And I want those of us who are on the skeptical side to understand that people can also come to the conclusion that Joseph Smith was a polygamist based on the documents, and we don't need to judge or vilify one another. We just prioritize things differently and explain them differently.
And again, I feel a bit uncomfortable because I don't have a lot of these documents I look at and I don't have a conclusion yet. I cannot explain them, or and I don't want people to then just say, "Oh, Michelle kicked your butt," No. but I do
that.
Right. So, but we would welcome all your comments if you see something in these documents that we haven't seen yet, or thought of a way to look at them that we haven't looked at them yet. We'd love to hear that. That would be really fabulous. And that's what we really encourage, is this big conversation between.
And that really is an invitation to the academics, right? Because my side has had a little bit more of a jumpstart because we have been looking at all of these documents critically, and the standard narrative, though I don't know if that's the right term, but the people who support the standard narrative haven't necessarily looked at these critically yet, so they might not have like Cheryl doesn't have her narrative supported yet, but
I don't have a story about it. I don't have a story about it. And that's often the case in my looking at historical documents is I do like to analyze. That's part of a historian's job, is to analyze the documents. But so far, I do not have an analysis of the Whitney documents. So right now, I'm just at the stage where I'm looking and saying, "Oh, this is interesting. Look at this, and look at these problems with it," and that kind of thing. And it's fun. It's really fun.
And I so appreciate that you have been willing to take the first, really what's proving to be the most difficult step for accredited historians, is to acknowledge, oh, there are questions about these, right? That seems to be the important step that we're asking other historians to be willing to take.
Okay, so let's go on to the third document, which is a cute little document here, almost like a stationery. So this is a blessing to Sarah Ann Whitney by her alleged husband, Joseph Smith. And the Joseph Smith Papers has identified this handwriting once again as Joseph Smith's handwriting. However, Michelle in her podcast did a fascinating look at this piece of paper and where it possibly came from. And she drew upon the expertise of John Hyacek, who came and looked at another document that was on the same paper at BYU, and talked about it perhaps not being from the period of 1840. It's dated 1843, is it? March 1840.
Yes, I believe this would be 1843, just a month, March 23rd, 1843, I believe just a month before the supposed pretended marriage to Joseph C. Kingsbury.
So I love this document, and to me, it does tend to support polygamy, because Joseph Smith was not known to give blessings like this in the Nauvoo period, and so it means that Sarah Ann was someone very special to him, that he would give her such a blessing. But again, we have some difficulties with the dating of this and the paper, and maybe Michelle just quickly sum that up for us.
Oh, okay. So first of all, should we talk about the wording and the challenge of rejecting or accepting a document based on wording? Do you want to?
Okay. Yes.
Do you want to start on that?
And I really appreciated Michelle in her podcast talked about. Well, first of all, she said that she didn't think that this wording, "Oh Lord, my God," sounded to her like it came from Joseph Smith.
And not just that one phrase, throughout. It sounds,
right. It didn't sound like the wording Joseph Smith would give. But she was careful to say that we do not have a lot of documents in Joseph Smith's actual handwriting. We don't know his voice. That's the problem, is we can't just say, oh, that doesn't sound like Joseph Smith to me, because we do not know his voice. We know the voice of scribes who wrote, synopses of his talks and things like that, but their voice would come in on this, and so
and I will say, part of my hesitance to say this absolutely answers that this is not Joseph Smith because of the wording is I have read some other documents that surprise me, that make me think, oh, I didn't know Joseph Smith would have said that. Right. So it gives me pause to say I can't perfectly predict. Like you said, we don't know his voice well enough.
Right. And so for me, this did sound like Joseph Smith, because I immediately thought of D&C 121 when he was in Liberty Jail, and he was was beseeching the Lord in sort of a similar way. And so it did sound like the voice of Joseph Smith to me.
Okay.
So also we had a fun little conversation. You should have been a fly on the wall when we were talking about the Masonic implications of this. And the "Oh Lord, my God," of course, is what Joseph Smith purportedly said as he jumped out the window to his death from Carthage jail.
And you said there were something like 6 witnesses outside that saw that. So that doesn't
there
just
are
depend on
several
Peter.
documents that talk about that being the final words of Joseph Smith as he fell from the window, or when he was hanging from the window, or there's several different discrepancies. But the interesting thing to me was we don't know that Joseph Smith was giving the Masonic call of distress by just the "Oh Lord, my God." But the interesting thing to me was seeing that all of the Mormons who talk about that later are very sure that he was giving the Masonic call of distress. Brigham Young later talks about the Masonic call of distress. John D. Lee even says that the last words of Joseph Smith were, "Oh Lord, my God, is there no help for the widow's son?" He goes ahead and adds that in just to make it clear in case nobody knew. And then one of the wives of Joseph Smith also says that that his last words were a Masonic call of distress, and why didn't any of those Masons answer that call of distress, and how horrible that was. So all of the Mormons that talk about that were quite sure that that's what he was doing. It's just a little interesting tidbit there.
That is, and it's also interesting, as we've talked about, to watch how stories become cemented and how they blow up and how they expand and become certain when maybe it wasn't before, which is one of the things I propose, that if this were written later in Utah and you wanted to sound like Joseph Smith, you might say, "Oh Lord, my God," because that was well known as his last word. So it can be seen as evidence either way. But it is interesting. Like, for example, the angel with the drawn sword and the angel with the flaming sword, and they just become these things that everybody knows, where the original evidence for them is maybe not as solid as people assume it is because of the later Utah period.
So one of the little examples that I have is I always talk about the lamb lying down with the lion, and we lion lying down with the lamb. And when we go back to the scriptures, we realize that that's not there. Moses isn't in there. And so why do we have that? It's because it's a later kind of addition that we've given it. And when we go back to the original documents and we look, we're like, oh, I didn't realize that wasn't there. I thought it was there.
Right. And so one of the other things we talked about back on the wording of this document, I think that while the voice isn't enough, saying that doesn't sound like Joseph Smith isn't enough to declare this document to be invalid, it is helpful because it was hearing the voice that inspired. It was Whitney Horning that said that. And I think, like, I give her credit for having read more of Joseph Smith than I have. So I trusted her analysis of that, but she didn't stop there and I didn't stop there. It was like, this doesn't sound like Joseph Smith, so let's go into the deeper exploration. And it was because of the voice that we did the deeper exploration to find out that Joseph was not in town the day that this blessing and the blessing to Joseph C. Kingsbury was supposedly given. To find out to question the paper, because I think this paper should strike everybody as strange, right? And being able to look at the paper and sorry. I overstated again. She's gonna help me.
And Michelle's often saying that something is strange or something is she just can't understand it, and I often say, for me, it's not, something's not strange. I might not be familiar with it, or it might be interesting, or it might just be fascinating, but I don't necessarily think we can say it's strange because we don't live in the 19th century. We don't know what was strange or not then. We don't know what was in Joseph Smith's mind. And it's just because something is strange to us personally, it might not be strange to my neighbor next door. It's just.
Yes. So let me correct, because often these are semantic. What I should have said is this seems to be unusual. I don't see other papers like this. That's when I said strange, I meant unusual. So often it's just a matter of using a better word that isn't. It can't be misunderstood.
Semantics. But also the other thing is the sealing is a different usage than it was earlier. So as historians know that sealing changed over the years in Joseph's usage. And this is one of the earlier usages where he is sealing things where we use sealing as pertaining to marriage, right?
Well, yeah, that's
everlasting covenant too.
It's the everlasting covenant, and it actually isn't explicit. It could be interpreted. I guess the thing that I was trying to pull out was that everlasting covenant takes on a different meaning later on than it appeared to have during Joseph's life. So when we read this and read everlasting covenant as evidence of polygamy, that's potentially problematic. Am I okay to say that? That's not necessarily a good interpretation if this document is genuine from Joseph Smith. But
you either have to say that it's not the usage that Joseph Smith would have used, or you would have to say that he changed his usage later in his life.
Right. And the only evidence we have of that is Section 132 and Section 131 and 132, which weren't added to the Doctrine and Covenants until 1876. And, so we have later, again, it's kind of that problem of, oh, Lord, my God, is there no help for the widow's son, coming about later and then being backdated onto Joseph Smith. So that's a challenge that we need to consider, I think.
So we would want to look for corroborating documents to see that he is actually changing this understanding of the everlasting covenant into this one that's appearing in this letter. So just real quick, going back to John Hyacek's look at this paper.
The paper, can I fill that in really fast?
Yes,
so
please.
so when I said that this paper was unusual, it's just so unique from anything else on the Joseph Smith papers. And since we started to ask the question of whether or not this was a legitimate Joseph Smith document, or a later someone writing in Joseph Smith's hand, possibly. So we started to question the paper. So I have this other document, but you go ahead, Cheryl, and tell your version of it, and then I can share that.
No, I just thought it was interesting. John said that this paper is usually dated. It started becoming into popularity in England in the 1840s, but it wasn't seen in the United States that early. Probably not until the 1850s or 1860s you would see this paper. So we have a couple of different ideas here, whether we have missionaries in England who could have brought this paper back. It could have been part of the stock of the Whitney store or the Red Brick store. Michelle talked a little bit about this. She did some fabulous research into it to look and see where they were getting their inventory, and she's just done a lot. If you listen to that podcast, that third podcast, you will be amazed at how much research she has done on this little piece of paper. I was absolutely amazed I have not seen anyone else look at this piece of paper in such a great depth as she has. And so it was fascinating to me. And really, if you're going to watch none other than that third podcast, it's amazing. You've done great work on this.
Well, thank you, Cheryl. I really appreciate that. Yeah, I tried to think of everything I could. I will say it was really fun to learn about this other document that is written on the same paper that was housed at BYU. And it was actually Cheryl that said, why don't you go look at this at BYU? Go check it out. Because I didn't realize that I could. And so I immediately called John and asked him to meet me. And this is interesting because it is the same. It's the only document that we know of on that same stationery, written by Helen Mar Whitney, I guess. And it's interesting because we can't say for sure whether this was written in Nauvoo or in Utah, but I will point out that I didn't bring this out in my podcast, and I wish I had. This is signed, you can see right here, by Helen Mar Whitney, which means that this would have been later. This would have been quite a while, like very possibly in Utah. I can't say for certain, but my hunch would be in Utah, but definitely after she was married. So it would have been later by quite a bit than when Joseph would have given that blessing to Sarah Ann. So that's another clue that is interesting.
I mean, these are all clues, but I mean, you can have your box of stationery for many years. I have a few boxes of stationery that have been around for 20 years. So
right. But it would have most likely had to have crossed the plains, which is interesting.
Yeah, which would have been hard. So so there are just so many interesting things about these little documents. They're very, very cool to look at. So we want to just go on from these documents that Michelle has talked about into a few of the Kingsbury documents, because Sarah Whitney was married to Joseph Smith, and then she had a pretend marriage to Joseph C. Kingsbury, who tells about it later. And this comes in because he gives some reminiscences. Do you have that one too? I don't know.
I'm wondering which page you want to share. And I'm going to have to push back on you now, Cheryl, because you did the bad thing where you said Joseph was married to Sarah. We have to acknowledge that is possibly, or,
Yes. So Joseph Kingsbury says that in his reminiscences, he talks about him, and this one was written in 1848.
Yes, can I show them how we date that? So you can see all of these first pages that I'm clicking through, and it looks like it was probably paginated later. That looks to be different, the 21, 22. And here we have, you can see all the way from the beginning, it's the same pen until here on page 26. So it's easy to assume that was all written at a similar time. And then we have this entry right here. I mean, where it ends is I should go back a little bit and read from the last page, but we are now in, Cheryl is much better at reading these than I am. We
Yeah,
are
but I can't see that
now
little
in a
tiny
fort, both comfortable, something comfortable, and are doing all we can to raise our living in and tilling the earth. June 25th, 1848 is when it's dated, when that first 26-page entry is dated. So, okay.
Right. So he starts from his birth and he goes all the way through and he tells this little story of how Joseph married Sarah Ann and that he was to have a pretend marriage so that Joseph wouldn't get in trouble, so it wouldn't be suspicious.
Right.
So he did marry her. Is that on this page?
Let me share this page right here. According to President Joseph Smith's counsel and others, I agreed to stand by. Oops, I turned the page by accident. Stand by Sarah Ann Whitney as supposed to be her husband and had a pretended marriage for the purpose of
bringing about the purposes of God in these last days, so spoken by the mouth of the prophets, Isaiah, etc. Okay, so this is actually in 1848, which I think is quite early. I think it's pretty early, but he is in Utah at the time, so it is a Utah period document.
It's before 132 is revealed, right? It's before the revelation is revealed, so it is quite early.
So one of the earliest documents talking about polygamy that we have, and talking about how Joseph was married to a woman. And so I take this one quite seriously. I love this document. And it was also, Michelle and I were discussing this today and had such fun with it. There are, throughout the document, there are some little writings, if she can find them.
Yep, I'll go back and share this one again and find some of the pages where we can find,
here's gone through the document and made some corrections on these.
So we
have this date right here. So kind of look in the middle of the right-hand page, the 22nd day of November, 1845, and someone has taken a pen and overwritten that 1844, because later on in the page, it talks about January 1845. And so they've corrected those dates because they don't make sense, right? They're not chronological. But what we
when we look, go ahead. When we looked back at it, we realized that Kingsbury's dates were actually better than the corrected dates.
Yes, but we did need to correct because it should have been November of 1845 and then January of 1846. So he didn't get the dates right, and neither did the corrector. But we know, because we know when the temple was open and when they were doing endowments in the temple was late 1845 and early 1846. So we figure that's what he meant. And so this is a sample of, they can get their dates wrong and they can still be fine. It's just because when you're looking back or when you're writing the document, often the dates kind of get messed up. And so we don't have to have a big fit about it, right?
I've sometimes put the wrong year on a slide just out of a typo, or, I just wasn't being quite careful enough. So yes, you can see more of this purple correction and more of these editing marks. Was there something else you wanted to point out, or did you want to talk about that? Because that was
so right there on page 29, it's just below what she's looking at here. And so we talks about my gospel father. Okay, there it is.
Yes.
So we're talking about with Bishop N.K. Whitney, my father, and someone has inserted that word gospel right above, my gospel father, and to make it plain that this was an adoption, that it wasn't he wasn't his actual father, he was his adoptive father. So they just clarified that. And so by that, we were able to tell who it was that was making these corrections.
We were curious, wondering who was it that was making these corrections, right? We had that question. And so, so go ahead, Cheryl. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
So I don't know if you have the typescript. You probably have the typescript.
I do.
The typescript was written by
a granddaughter, I believe. So let me go back to it.
But it was one of Joseph Kingsbury's granddaughters who had his they call it the autobiography and journal, but we call it his reminiscences. That's a little bit more accurate. But she made this typescript and then gave it to Joseph F. Smith. And when we look back, it has those changes, the 1844 and the gospel father, and they're just put right into the text as if they were written by him.
Yes, and my computer's going very slow, so it's taking me a minute. Let me add this back to the stage. and I'll show you right here who it was. We could call her Miss Purple Pen, right? Who it was that was making the corrections. History of Joseph C. Kingsbury, copied from his own handwriting in his little books where he kept his diary by his granddaughter, Roselia Meservey Watson.
Right. So.
And I want to pay attention here. People date this from 1846, but it's important to point out that that's just her assumption. I think that we've done a little bit better analysis to date it from 1848, what we just showed.
Yeah, so we're pretty sure about the date of 1848 when we go back to the original diary / reminiscences. So,
right, unless there's something we've missed, as always.
So also that's another thing is when you look at these documents, often it's really easy to read the typescript. And so people don't go back to the handwriting. I love the handwriting. I am very good at reading 19th century handwriting. And so I always go to the handwriting. But when you go to the typescript, you really need to check it with the handwriting because often there are small changes that are made later in problems in making the typescript. They didn't read a word right or whatever. And it can make a big difference.
Like the dating that we just pointed out, that dating would be a really big problem. And I want to point out, so I'll show right here that for some reason, the typescript is available on the Church History Library. But interestingly, let's see if I can get there. The original is I could only find it on archive.org. And so it's interesting that it's not in the Church History Library, but you do have to sometimes be creative and search different sources to try to find, because if you can only find the typescript on the Church History Library, you might think that's all that we have. But this, I would say, is far more valuable.
If it is all that we have, if the typescript is all that we have, we can't date it back to that earlier date. We have to date it to when the typescript was created because that's the earliest document we have. And so on the timeline, it's important to look at these different things and don't just jump to the conclusion, oh, this is 1848. No, if we only have it back to 1912, then that's the date. Yeah.
And like we said, if we only had this typescript right here, we would date it to 46 because that's what the typescript says, where when we go to the original, we can see that it's most likely 48.
Yeah, so that's kind of some of the fun things that we've been doing together lately. Is there any other documents we've looked at that we want to talk about?
Well, we could talk quite a bit more about the affidavits because I don't know if we want to right now, but I think both Cheryl and I are committed to doing a much more thorough investigation of the affidavits. One of the questions we've had is whether the affidavits are copies or meant to be originals. And I think that we see that quite differently. And but I will show this one example. I explained was it part 2 that I explained the sort of Joseph F. Smith's 4 books of affidavits. It was part 2 or part 3, but I think maybe part 2. And so I'll just show this. I find really interesting. So this is the affidavit of, I believe it's David Fulmer, and it's one of the affidavits about the High Council meeting. And it's really interesting because you can see that it is a signed affidavit, right? And it looks like it's signed, or supposed to be signed by David Fulmer, not just by Joseph F. Smith. That's a different hand. And right here, we can go up and you can see, if you look close, maybe I'll zoom in a little bit, you can see that names have been scratched out. Right here and right here on both sides of Samuel Bent. And that's really interesting on an affidavit. Those are supposed to be legal documents. So I'll show, and that was from series 1. Oh no, that's from series 2. And this is from series 1. I showed them in the wrong order. So I should have showed this one first, but they're the same thing. This is series 1, where it has the same thing, where the names are crossed out, but this one happens to have A. Cutler penciled in after. And then another name scratched out here. So you could see that these don't appear to me to be copies because they are being changed and altered after the fact rather than just copied as they were. So these are the kinds of things that I think it's useful to, one of the things
this is
that
where we need, let me jump in. This is where we need lots of brains, because sometimes names were in documents, in church documents, we see this a few times, like when William Law and William Marks were kind of marked out because then they apostatized and they didn't want to include them in with the faithful. So, I mean, there were several times when when we see this happen. And so there could be different reasons why we have this. Is very fascinating. It's definitely needs investigation. We need to think of why or what those names might have been, why they might have been crossed out, and when or erased, and when they were erased. Were they erased before the signature was placed on the document? Were they erased after? What was the motivation of doing this? Like, why do you see this as being fitting into a different narrative? Because I don't necessarily see it as being suspicious, but
right. One of the things, though, that I think that I propose, that I think, Cheryl, you agreed to, and maybe you'll think differently about it now, but it appears to me that Joseph F. Smith wanted these documents to have sort of the legal status, the viability of being affidavits. So he tried to create them as legal affidavits. But I think it's important for us to recognize that they don't necessarily deserve that level of viability because of the questions we have about them and some of the issues with them. So he was trying to create these very official, reliable documents, but they don't necessarily rise to that level in actuality.
Yeah, so let me just talk about the affidavits in my perspective, because I started out with, before I had looked at the affidavits closely, I just thought, and I think many people do think, that the affidavits kind of nail down Joseph Smith's polygamy, that here we have these affidavits of the women who were married to Joseph Smith. What can you say about that? And when I started looking at them and seeing the problems with signatures, that they don't always have signatures, to me, they seem to be copies, and that's not suspicious, because when I went through the Masonic Lodge minutes, I saw often they would put in a letter from somebody, and then they'd just copy it into the book, and they wouldn't have the signature of the person. They'd just have a copy of the letter with, writing that signature. And so that was sort of normal for the time. It's also seen in the Relief Society minutes. And so it didn't bother me quite so much, but I did see certain things about the affidavits that I thought were unusual and didn't make them quite as just
reliable, maybe?
Yeah, maybe reliable. It's not that I felt they were unreliable. It's just that they weren't like firsthand documents of the person with their actual signature there, and so and there's several problems in some of the affidavits, and it looks like many of them were written in form style, where they just have the same thing repeated. So it almost looks like he wrote these affidavits and then later had the women come in and I don't know exactly how they were created. So that's what I realized. I guess I realized I don't know exactly how they were created. I don't know how for what purpose or what involvement the women had. Were they telling their own stories, or were the affidavits created and then they were later asked to sign them? We just don't know those things.
Or were they sometimes created and signed on their behalf without any involvement from them? We have all of those
and then
questions.
some of them were not signed at all. They were just created, but the signature was left blank, which actually, to me, it makes it more likely when he just writes the signature that woman had agreed to it, because otherwise he would have just signed them all, right? Why were some of them, there are two of them, right, that are left blank, where they don't have their name, and they refuse to sign it?
It would be interesting to compare the affidavits to, say, Andrew Jensen's list of first wives, and to see where Joseph F. Smith might have been getting his information of who to include for an affidavit. I haven't done an in-depth search, but I did look briefly to try to see if he had advertised in the Deseret News, any wives of Joseph Smith, come and sign an affidavit, or how he was Like, it would be interesting to see.
And I hesitate to say much about this, but I know there is some information which I'm not real sure, so that's why I can't say it because I haven't seen it. But I know there is some information about how the first few were created, and so this is something that we need more work on. We need more work on the affidavits, and it would be really helpful to this conversation if we had more close work on the affidavits.
Yes. So I guess I'm summing this up by saying Cheryl and I are doing this work, and I know other people in especially my community are doing this work, more of the skeptical side, but we are asking more people from the historical side to also join in. It really is astounding that more work hasn't been done on these affidavits. And that's a huge part of what both Cheryl and I are talking about. The field is white and ready to harvest, right? That's what we're trying to say in the study of polygamy. There is so much opportunity here and so much need for
just
good
one more
scholarship.
thing before we close, because I don't want this to be a very long one, because I do want you to go back and look at the other three. But I do just want to say here that I feel like that our community, the scholarly community, has for so long felt like these should be interpreted one way, or that they were very easy to look at and just see, like, why aren't we believing the women who are writing these affidavits? And me, as I've gone in and I've looked at these documents, I've realized that there's still a lot of work to be done. And so I really implore you to not just stand on what you've thought in the past, and start looking at these new close looks that Michelle and others have been taking. And don't feel threatened by it, because I haven't found anything threatening about this work at all as I've been talking with Michelle. Sometimes we get quite heated about our conversations, but yet, it's not threatening, and it's, I kind of hate when people connect this investigation with other things that are extraneous to it. Okay.
Yes.
So don't worry about if you've seen, Cheryl Bruno doing something, I don't know.
Cheryl Bruno made some tarot cards, therefore
right.
run
I
away.
made some tarot cards, right? So you're not going to listen to anything I now say about the Joseph Smith affidavits. So that's not fair.
And the same on my side.
Exactly. So I implore you to jump into the conversation with us and have a great time.
Excellent. This is how history is done. This is how it's supposed to be done, right? And that's what we were hoping will continue. So again, a huge thank you to Cheryl for engaging the way that she has. You guys, she really has put herself out to work hand in hand with me to try to bring these conversations to the table, to try to improve the dialogue and the scholarship on these topics. And so I hope that everyone will continue to engage in these topics, make room in their space for alternative perspectives, alternative voices, the way that Cheryl and I have stuck in there and sometimes fought it out, right? But we've both continued, and a lot of good has come from it already. And then again, I want to recommend the Journal of Mormon Polygamy. So I want to ask everyone to please support us, even with your prayers at this point, or in any way that you feel that you can, with the success of the Journal of Mormon Polygamy. We already do have some people fighting against us, and so it's going to take all that we can do. Cheryl and I are extremely committed to making this a success. As we said, we have a fantastic board of directors. I think everybody is going to be happily surprised by the people that are involved and sitting around the table with this endeavor. So our website will be up in the not too distant future, and we will start accepting submissions. Be looking forward to it, and start working on your papers, everybody, from both perspectives. This really is going to be the cutting edge of where this topic is discussed. And so wherever you stand on this topic, you really don't want to be left behind. That's why we are encouraging people to engage. So thank you again, Cheryl. I really appreciate you. I really appreciate your work. I hope everybody in both communities does, because I think I'm just going to say, like, both of us are courageous in what we are doing. We are working hard, stepping out of our comfort zones, and we hope more people will follow suit.
Yes, I think you saw me stepping out of my comfort zone just now. But read my books. But really, I think that this is valuable and this is important, and I hope more people will join in.
Thank you so much, and we will see you next time. Thank you again to Cheryl for coming on and engaging today, and for her willingness to engage in all of this. I hope that everybody recognizes how courageous Cheryl is, how much integrity she has, and how much she is willing to step into this challenging space just because she thinks it's the right thing to do and she thinks these are important topics. And again, please watch for our website. It should be launching in the not too distant future. Be thinking about how you want to engage. And as always, I welcome your thoughts and discussion on the Whitney documents that we discussed today and any other topics. I'll see you next time.